Imagine stepping into a world where the average human lifespan wasn't 75 or even 50, but a shocking 12 years. Think about that. Most people watching this video, living in a world of modern medicine and safety, would be dead before they even hit puberty. This isn't a science fiction horror film or a hypothetical nightmare scenario conjured for entertainment. This was the grim, brutal reality for our ancient ancestors. The deck was stacked against them from the very second they drew their first breath, making every single day a miracle of survival. The question isn't if they would die young, but when and how violently their short lives would end. We, in the 21st century, often romanticize the past, picturing stoic hunters or peaceful agrarian communities living in harmony with nature. But this modern lens blinds us to the sheer terror and constant struggle that define daily existence for thousands of generations. We have completely detached ourselves from the basic grinding desperation of simply staying alive for another week, a challenge that demanded constant vigilance. This video is not just about citing bad years like 536 AD or the Black Death, which were catastrophic events. It's about the default conditions of human history that made life inherently short, brutal, and cursed. So what forces kept humanity locked into this 12-year death clock for so long? The biggest killers weren't always global pandemics or massive world wars. Often, it was just the small, relentless failures of existence itself. We're talking about the agonizing reality that a broken leg meant a certain slow end, or that the smallest infection was an uncurable death sentence. To truly understand the worst moments to be human, we must journey back to the very dawn of our species and look at the fundamental fragility of our bodies and societies. Our first stop on this journey back into human despair takes us to the Paleolithic, where the first members of the Homo genus walked upright, armed with little more than sharp stones and a growing intellect. This era was less about fighting neighboring tribes and more about avoiding becoming the dinner of a truly terrifying array of apex predators. We call this time the hunter-gatherer era, but for many, the title was simply the hunted, navigating a natural world designed to eliminate anything weak or slow. It was here, in the vast, unforgiving grasslands, that the concept of a 12-year lifespan was ruthlessly cemented into our biological history. The threat in this primitive world wasn't just external, though. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, where food was a rare privilege and survival was a non-stop, exhausting gamble. But even as our ancestors grew smarter, developing fire and tools, they couldn't escape the next great threat, the constant, grinding pressure of the natural world and the deadly consequences of simple bad luck. This early period set the stage for all the horrors that would follow. But before we look at the invisible killers that wiped out millions, let's explore the physical terror that ensured almost no one made it past childhood. In the Paleolithic, your life was a statistical anomaly if you reached your teens, and the environment was the primary executioner. A simple scratch from a thorn could kill you. A slightly misjudged step could break an ankle, and a broken ankle meant immediate abandonment by your nomadic group. There were no hospitals, no rehabilitation, only the swift, brutal justice of natural selection that valued mobility above all else. This harsh reality ensured that physical vulnerability was the single greatest predictor of early death, demanding peak physical condition just to survive a cold night. The constant caloric deficit was another unseen killer, especially during seasonal changes or unexpected migrations of game. Starvation didn't just kill the elderly or the sick. It targeted the young, preventing vital growth and crushing the immune systems of children before they had a chance to develop. Every hunter who returned empty-handed was essentially signing a death warrant for a member of the group, placing an unbearable, relentless pressure on every single individual to constantly provide. This scarcity made the early human existence a chronic state of emergency, a perpetual hunger that gnawed at the edges of consciousness. And then there were the giants, the apex predators that viewed a small, two-legged proto-human as a relatively easy source of protein. We were simultaneously becoming smarter than the animals, but were physically outmatched by beasts like the cave bear or the terrifying Smilodon. Imagine spending every waking moment not just looking for food, but also looking over your shoulder, knowing that your child could be snatched in a split second. This psychological trauma was an ever-present, silent partner to the physical threat, wearing down the mental fortitude of every survivor. The advent of rudimentary tools, while revolutionary, introduced a new, surprising source of mortality: workplace accidents. Handling sharp obsidian or flint was risky, and a deep cut could lead to a fatal infection faster than any animal attack. Furthermore, the very act of hunting using a spear or throwing an axe was inherently dangerous, leading to frequent trauma that modern humans would easily survive. The tools that gave us a fighting chance against nature also guaranteed a steady flow of minor injuries that frequently spiraled into deadly complications. Survival, then, was defined less by intelligence and more by sheer, agonizing luck, coupled with immense physical resilience against a hostile environment. But as humans slowly transitioned out of the Paleolithic and began to settle, they unintentionally traded one set of brutal killers for another, far more efficient group of murderers. We thought settling down would make life easier, but in reality we opened the door to the invisible, silent assassins that would truly cement the cursed part of our history. The biggest mistake humanity made, ironically, was succeeding in agriculture, a change that rapidly introduced the biological curse. Moving from small, spread-out nomadic groups to dense, settled villages allowed diseases to pass easily between people, giving rise to pathogens that could not have existed before. This close proximity meant that once a disease arrived, it was no longer an isolated incident. It was a devastating, unavoidable community catastrophe targeting every single person. Furthermore, the domestication of animals, the very foundation of stable food supply, was the perfect vector for zoonotic diseases. Early farmers were suddenly in constant contact with pigs, chickens, and cattle, animals that carried unique viruses and bacteria that jumped the species barrier. Measles, smallpox, and influenza are all thought to have originated from this close contact, proving that our allies in the food chain were also our greatest biological enemies. We essentially invited the next wave of killers right into our homes and barns. The focus on staple crops like wheat or rice, while necessary for feeding large populations, led to widespread nutritional deficiencies. The diet of a settled farmer lacked the diversity and protein density of the hunter-gatherer diet, resulting in weaker immune systems, stunted growth, and increased susceptibility to infection. Even if a child survived smallpox, they were left physically and mentally impaired by the lack of proper sustenance, making them vulnerable to the next passing illness. Stability did not equal health. It equaled concentrated sickness. The lack of sanitation was the final nail in the coffin of early human health, especially for the young. Waste disposal was virtually non-existent, leading to the rapid contamination of water sources with human and animal feces. Diseases like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever became chronic, deadly features of settled life, particularly lethal to small children whose bodies couldn't cope with constant dehydration. The places where civilization thrived, the rivers and fertile valleys, were simultaneously the breeding grounds for these microscopic plagues. This era proves that a life expectancy of 12 years was not just an outcome of violence or predation. It was a relentless cycle of poor nutrition, crowded living, and contaminated water that relentlessly targeted infants and children. As populations continued to grow and trade routes expanded, these localized plagues metastasized, culminating in massive, world-altering events where the system of civilization collapsed under the weight of its own biological failures. While daily life for early humans was brutal, there were specific, catastrophic years when the cumulative effects of nature and biology created a scenario so terrible it transcended normal suffering. The year 536 AD is consistently cited by historians as arguably the worst single year in human history, not because of a war but because the very sun abandoned the earth. A massive volcanic eruption, likely in Iceland, blanketed the northern hemisphere in a thick, persistent veil of ash and dust. This apocalyptic cloud blocked out the sun's light for a terrifying 18 months, plunging Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia into a prolonged, unseasonal winter. Temperatures plummeted dramatically, in some places by over 2.5 degrees Celsius, initiating the coldest decade in over 2,000 years. A global cooling event that immediately shattered agricultural cycles. Crops failed repeatedly and across continents, wiping out entire harvests and destroying the precarious food reserves of the early medieval world. The resulting famine was swift, widespread, and absolute, leading to mass starvation that crippled empires and destroyed nascent kingdoms. Written accounts from the time describe the sun losing its brightness, appearing moon-like, and people dying by the thousands in cities where no food could be found. This sudden environmental shock exposed the profound fragility of human civilization, showing how easily our carefully constructed societies could be brought to their knees by a single geological event. The chaos of the famine was quickly followed by the Justinianic plague just a few years later, an early strain of the bubonic plague. Historians argue that the weakened state of the population, starving, cold, and displaced by crop failure, created the perfect environment for the plague to ravage the remnants of the Eastern Roman Empire and beyond. The environmental disaster essentially lowered the biological defenses of an entire generation, preparing them for the bacterial onslaught that followed. The year 536 AD serves as a chilling reminder that the Earth itself holds the ultimate power to reset human civilization, triggering a chain reaction of famine, disease, and political collapse that redefined the Dark Ages. This single event, however, was only a preview of how devastating the combination of climate, hunger, and disease could be when unleashed upon an unsuspecting world. If 536 AD showed the power of the volcano, the Black Death of the 14th century demonstrated the horrific efficiency of biological terror against a densely populated world. Originating likely in Asia, the plague arrived in Europe via trade routes, quickly wiping out an estimated 30 to 60% of the continent's population in just a few years. It was a demographic disaster of unimaginable scale, killing hundreds of millions globally. The psychological impact was arguably as terrifying as the physical one. Death was swift, agonizing, and seemingly random, striking rich and poor, young and old, with no apparent logic. Entire families were extinguished within days, leading to the complete breakdown of social order, governmental authority, and religious faith. People turned to extreme hedonism or violent flagellation out of sheer desperation, believing the catastrophe to be a divine curse. The Black Death not only killed people but also destroyed the infrastructure that kept them alive, leading to secondary waves of death from neglect, famine, and violence. Crops rotted in the fields, livestock wandered untended, and the systems of trade and sanitation completely collapsed, ensuring that even survivors faced bleak prospects. The very notion of community dissolved as fear drove people to abandon their neighbors, leaving the sick to die alone. Crucially, the plague highlights how human behavior amplified the natural catastrophe. The medieval trade networks, which represented progress and wealth, became the superhighways of death, ensuring the rapid global spread of the bacterium. Similarly, the crowded, unsanitary conditions of medieval cities, a result of growing populations, turned urban centers into perfect, concentrated killing zones. The Black Death did more than just kill. It fundamentally reshaped the course of Western civilization, leaving an indelible scar on the global psyche and reinforcing the idea that progress itself often carries the seeds of ultimate collapse. But while this plague was a biological horror, human history has darker chapters where the intent was malice, not just misfortune. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas triggered one of the single most catastrophic demographic collapses in human history, an event sometimes known as the Great Dying. This period was a unique, nightmarish fusion of biological vulnerability and deliberate human exploitation, cementing its place as a uniquely brutal era. Here, the sheer lack of prior exposure to Eurasian diseases proved fatal for entire civilizations. The indigenous populations of the Americas had no biological defense against illnesses like smallpox, measles, and influenza, diseases that Europeans had developed immunities to over centuries of crowded living. When these pathogens arrived, they swept through the continents like wildfire, often killing up to 90% of local populations even before the Europeans physically arrived. This was biological warfare by tragic accident of history, a silent and devastating conquest. The scale of the death was apocalyptic. Millions upon millions perished, leading to the complete social and political disintegration of empires like the Aztec and Inca. Entire languages and cultural histories were erased in a matter of decades, demonstrating how vulnerable even large, sophisticated civilizations are to an invisible enemy. The Great Dying fundamentally rewrote the human geography of two continents, creating a massive generational wound that never truly healed. Furthermore, this biological vulnerability was quickly and brutally exploited by the colonizers, who used the resulting chaos and depopulation to justify conquest, enslavement, and the seizure of land. The period wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a human-engineered catastrophe built upon the foundation of massive biological suffering, a combination that makes it one of the most uniquely cursed moments in history. This conquest serves as a chilling example of how the vulnerability of one population can be violently leveraged by another, proving that sometimes the worst time to be human is when your mere existence intersects with the ambition and indifference of a powerful invading force. Yet, the 20th century would prove that humanity was capable of creating even more efficient and methodical systems of suffering. We might believe that the brutality of history belongs to the past, to the Dark Ages or the time of plagues, but the 20th century introduced a new, terrifying dimension: industrialized suffering. The world wars demonstrated that the most sophisticated creatures on Earth are also the most capable of mass, intentional self-destruction using technology to optimize the killing process. World War I, with its endless trench warfare and introduction of chemical weapons, redefined the concept of meaningless, agonizing death. It was a horrifying stalemate where millions of lives were sacrificed for a few meters of mud, demonstrating a profound devaluation of human life by national governments. The scale of the slaughter was unprecedented, but it was just a prelude to the horrors that followed 2 decades later. World War II brought the concept of organized genocide to its horrific zenith. The Holocaust was not a chaotic event. It was a bureaucratic, methodical system designed for the efficient eradication of specific groups of people. This level of institutionalized malice, turning state infrastructure into a vast machine of death, represented a moral nadir for humanity. It proved that human intellect, when divorced from morality, is the ultimate engine of terror. Beyond the wars, the century saw state-sponsored terror in the form of Stalin's purges, Mao's Great Leap Forward, and the Cambodian genocide, where rulers intentionally starved, imprisoned, and murdered tens of millions of their own citizens. These political horrors, using manufactured famine and forced labor, show that the enemy wasn't always a foreign power or a bacteria. Often, it was the very government sworn to protect you. The 20th century forces us to confront the reality that for all our medical and technological progress, we remain capable of the deepest, most systematic forms of cruelty. While we defeated many of the biological threats of the past, we unleashed a uniquely modern form of terror that makes us question whether true progress is even possible. But thankfully, the story doesn't end in the trenches or the concentration camps. We did eventually find a way out of the 12-year death clock. After enduring eons of the Paleolithic nightmare, the biological curse, and the apex of cruelty, humanity finally achieved its great escape from the 12-year death clock. This monumental shift, the greatest success story in human history, didn't happen overnight, but rather through a series of humble and seemingly simple societal changes. The true heroes of this story are not conquerors or kings, but engineers and scientists who focused on sanitation and public health. The simple act of separating clean drinking water from sewage, something completely foreign to our ancestors, immediately began to cut the mortality rates from cholera and typhoid, saving countless children. This infrastructure, often overlooked, is the silent foundation of our modern lifespan. Then came the biological breakthroughs, the development of vaccines, which tamed once terrifying killers like smallpox and polio, and the discovery of antibiotics, which turned a simple scratch into a non-issue rather than a death sentence. It was the mass deployment of these tools, coupled with improved nutrition and agricultural efficiency, that allowed the average person to finally live long enough to die of natural causes, rather than infectious ones. Today, if you live in a developed nation, your likelihood of surviving childhood is nearly 100%. And your average lifespan stretches beyond 70 years, a biological miracle that your ancestors could only dream of. The entire existence of a healthy senior citizen today is a triumph over millennia of ecological and biological adversity, proving that human ingenuity, when applied to compassion, can defeat the brute force of nature. Our ability to survive the Paleolithic, endure the plagues, and learn from the 20th century's mistakes is the ultimate testament to our resilience. So, as you reflect on these cursed eras, appreciate the absolute statistical anomaly that is your own existence. Now, let us know in the comments, which of these brutal historical periods do you think was the absolute worst time to be human?